You could see a black eye or where he had hit her on her face or something.
She looked extraordinarily beaten down.
Something that struck me about Pedro Alonso was how cold he acted when he was identifying the grave sites.
I will always be alone in my heart for it.
Today we're talking about Ed Gein, who inspired some of the most famous films in Hollywood, all thanks to his obsession with his mother. Then we have Ray Copeland, a seemingly innocent farm owner who used his employees to commit fraud before killing them off. And lastly, we're talking about Pedro Lopez, a man who is single-handedly responsible for the death of over 300 young girls. Stay tuned till the end of this video as we dive deep into old men who ended up as the freakiest killers in the world. Alfred Hitchcock's Norman Bates has got nothing on Ed Gein, a real-life grave robber who hid his dark side behind the guise of being a gentle old man. But what most people didn't know was Ed had mommy issues like no other. So how did he end up becoming one of the creepiest serial killers of all time? Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin in 1906. And saying that his childhood was tough would be an understatement. Born to an alcoholic father and a matriarch mother who constantly criticized and tortured him and his older brother, Ed grew up with a twisted view of the world. His mother had taught him to believe that all women were evil. Her extremist opinions about love, relationships, and desire had a huge impact on Ed as he grew up. He eventually ended up losing his entire family. First, his father passed away, and then it was his brother's turn, who died in a suspicious fire. 4 years later, his mother passed away, leaving Ed to live on their farm all by himself. Before his mother passed away, Gein had stopped going out or interacting with anyone. He had devoted himself to his mother, taking care of her every waking moment of the day. So when she died, he was completely lost in life. And that's when his mental health issues started taking shape.
That's like a very common thing when people are going through grief. They tend to keep the house the same exact was as when the person left. It's more of like a coping thing. Even in just these 2 rooms that he confined himself into, they got extremely dirty. They looked like a hoarder's room.
In true Norman Bates fashion, Ed's obsession with his mother and her leftover belongings increased after her passing away. After her death, he completely cut himself off from the outside world. And while people thought it was only natural for him to want some time to grieve, they had no idea what was really going on inside his house. Mind you that Ed was around 50 at this point. He would regularly babysit a bunch of kids in the neighborhood and was generally known to be a nice guy by everyone. Ed started spending most of his time in his mom's room, cleaning everything over and over again, making sure that her things remained spotless. But the rest of the house? It was a huge mess. Dishes were piling up everywhere, his clothes went unwashed for months on end, food went to waste, and it was pretty obvious that Ed was in no state to continue living alone. He needed some serious help. This was around the same time when a bunch of people in his neighborhood started going missing, and nobody could figure out what was happening to them. Among these missing people, the case of Bernice Warden. Bernice went missing in November 1957 from a hardware store where she worked. The police arrived on the scene and discovered that the cash register had been stolen, with a trail of Bernice's that led to the back door, which is where the criminal made an escape from. Thankfully, Bernice's son was a deputy sheriff, and his suspicion immediately went to Gein, who would often visit his mother's store. So Sheriff Frank Warden launched an investigation and started tailing Ed, unknown to him. Frank discovered that Ed had been to the shop the day his mother had disappeared, and he returned back the next morning, looking for a gallon of antifreeze that's used as a preservative. Soon enough, he had the grounds to arrest him and search his house for any clues. And what the authorities found when they reached there is a different story altogether. Not only did the police find Worden's dismembered corpse inside Ed's house, they also found tons of other human body parts and organs displayed everywhere, as if they were trophies. Ed had stored human organs in jars, decorated his house with human bones, and even turned skulls into makeshift soup bowls. The authorities dubbed the property Ed's House of Horrors because of all the unspeakable evidence they discovered that day. As far as Bernice was concerned, Ed had decapitated her and hung her body from the ceiling for some strange reason. Some people believed that Ed was actually a cannibal who feasted on his victims after murdering them, which is what he was going to do to Bernice, but the authorities got in the way of his plans.
Now, he confessed to killing two different women, two people, but during that time period, there was a couple other people that kind of disappeared or they were killed, and a lot of people think that he killed more than just the two, but confirmed it was these two different people. So Bernice Worden was actually the second woman that Ed had admitted to killing.
Of course, when all of this came to light, Ed had no choice but to fess up for his crimes. He admitted to killing Bernice, along with Mary Horden, another woman in the neighborhood whose disappearance had remained a mystery for many years. What's more is that he also admitted to digging up people's graves and stealing their bodies to satisfy his curiosity about the human anatomy. The police found anatomy books lying all over Ed's house, and the murderer himself claimed that he would dig out corpses and perform all kinds of experiments on them. He would cut off their body parts, make masks and suits from their skin, and wear them around the house. In some cases, he would also assault the corpses before dissecting them. To put things into perspective, the kind of things that the police found at Ed's house included leggings made of human skin, Mary Hogan's skull kept in a box, Bernice's heart kept in a plastic bag, several severed noses and lips along with fingernails, and other unimaginable things that are just too gross to mention. And to this day, no one knows what really went on inside his head for Ed to have done all of this. Gein told the investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he had made 40 local visits to graveyards in the dead of night in what he called a daze-like state, where he didn't know what he was doing. During these trips, he would dig up the graves and bring the dead bodies to his house. Most of these corpses were of women whom Ed thought resembled his mother. And the reason why he used their skins to make masks and suits was that he wanted to recreate his mother and make a woman's suit. He wanted to then wear this suit to feel closer to his mother, almost becoming her in a way. As the investigation went on, the police traced multiple disappearances to Ed's House of Horrors, and while Ed never really ended up admitting to all of his crimes, the evidence that the authorities had against him was enough to put him behind bars for good. At the same time, though, Ed's own lawyer tried his hardest to make sure that Ed wouldn't go to trial. He cited several mental health issues as his reason, helping Ed plead not guilty by reason of insanity. And while the doctors seemed to agree, because in January 1958, Ed was declared unfit to stand trial, and instead of being sent to jail, he was committed to Central State Hospital to undergo psychological treatment. However, the law wasn't going to let this one go. 10 years later, Ed finally was mentally healthy enough to stand trial and give an explanation for all his crimes. And while he was found to be completely guilty of Bernice's murder, his insanity plea once again stopped the judge from convicting him to life in prison. He was once again admitted to Central State Hospital, where he kept a low profile, hoping for an early release on the grounds of good behavior. However, because he was declared to be a threat to others, his release appeal was rejected. Eventually, Ed ended up dying of cancer in 1984, bringing an end to his violent carnage. Ed's borderline insane obsession with his mother and the gruesome crimes that he committed in the wake of losing her made somewhat of a horror icon in pop culture. With Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, based on Ed Gein's life, everyone in the world has been exposed to the horrific ways in which this criminal mind worked, and all that it led to. What's even stranger is that Ed's murders have actually found themselves a little fan following over the years. These people believe that Ed was just a victim of his circumstances, which is what resulted in his terrible crimes. These people like to visit Ed's grave, leaving him flowers and notes because they think he was just misunderstood. Are they right? You be the judge of that.
Just ask people if they'd like to go out, make some money and, get paid at the end of the day, or, we can help you get some finances started. And they go out, get people and help them get an account started, in a bank.
Because Ray could not read or write. And with bookkeeping, writing names down where they were at, things like this, he needed somebody to write them down.
Ray's story starts all the way back in 1914. During his childhood, his family fell victim to the Great Depression, and as a result, Ray had to drop out of school and start working to put food on the table. With this kind of pressure following him early on in life, it's no surprise that he turned into a rebellious young man with some serious anger issues. Ray was only 20 when he committed his first recorded crime of stealing 2 hogs from a neighboring farm. In 1930, he was caught forging government checks and ended up being sentenced to a year in jail. However, that wasn't even the biggest of his crimes. In 1940, Ray met the love of his life, 19-year-old Faye, who was 7 years younger than him. Together, they had 5 children, and unknown to anyone on the outside, their married life was nothing but a sham.
You could see bruises on her, days that we would either come over and visit them or whatever. You could see a black eye or where he had her on her face or something.
Ray was extremely abusive to his wife and kids and would regularly beat them with just about anything he could find lying around the house.
One of these men who was offered that kind of money and a place to live, especially maybe in a country setting, why, it would be paradise. It would be something, it would be a dream come true for a man like that.
During all of this, he continued stealing things and selling them to make a few extra bucks. And then he actually started recruiting homeless people and drifters, employing them at his farm and making them buy cattle with his bad checks because the purchase wasn't in his name. No one would be able to trace the crimes back to him. As far as the drifters go, they would soon be out of town and out of reach once the deed was done. And for a while, Ray's crimes went completely unnoticed, until one of the drifters was caught and fessed up, resulting in Jay being arrested once again. However, the drifter's name was Jake McCormick, and he also tipped the authorities about some strange things that he witnessed while working for the Copelands. He reported that there were human bones stashed away on the farm, giving the authorities a heads up on what was actually going down there. The police then searched Ray's entire farm using cadaver dogs. However, the search came to a close when nothing was discovered. So, the only thing that the police then had against Ray was the fraud he was committing. McCormick also ended up telling police that while working for him, he once saw Ray emerging out of a neighbor's barn with a rifle, saying that he was there to shoot a raccoon.
Ray had told him there was a raccoon in the barn, and he wanted to kill this raccoon, and he needed Jack's assistance. So Ray had a .22 rifle in his hand. He went out to the barn. Ray gave him a stick and said, "Poke this stick in behind this stack of hay here, try to get that raccoon to come out and I'll shoot him."
McCormick also told the authorities that Ray had then pointed the gun right at him.
"I never did take my eyes off of him. I'm looking back up at him all the time. I didn't want to run off because I was afraid he would shoot me then, at that point."
But somehow he managed to talk him out of it, promising him that he would leave town and never tell anyone what he had witnessed. But before letting him go, Ray took McCormick to the bank to make sure that his scam transaction was complete. However, that's when McCormick took the chance to slip out and make a run for it. And when he was safely away from Copeland, that's when he decided to make a phone call to the authorities.
There were 8 men wanted for writing bad checks to cattle auction houses in central Missouri. All had disappeared from the area without a trace.
And while the investigation didn't result in any solid evidence, McCormick's story made a lot of sense.
So you didn't have anything to do with their disappearance?
I have. Well, you won't find no bodies.
Is that right? But the worst thing about all this, Mr. Copeland, is I think a few of these people have died as a result.
Well, if they have, I didn't have anything to do with it.
At that point, the police were looking for 7 men who had committed check fraud, and for some reason, all of them had gone missing. With further probing, all 7 of these cases were traced to the Copelands. And while the police couldn't discover anything on their own farm, when they expanded the search to a neighboring barn, they found a shallow grave that contained the remains of 3 men, all of whom were proven to have been killed with the same gun that Ray owned. Another barn on the same property contained yet another dead body, with a bunch of clothes and a list of men's names with X's drawn next to them. Their names matched the names of criminals wanted for the infamous check fraud, and that's all it took for the authorities to realize that Ray had been the mastermind behind all of this. He would use these homeless men to commit his fraud, and then he would take their lives so that the crimes could never be traced back to him.
Say there is a guy in there. Yes, sir. Who's in there? I don't know that. And he's got a concrete block chain around.
And while it was extremely difficult for the police to discover the identities of their bodies, the evidence was just too compelling for them to charge Ray with 5 murders. Not just that, but Faye was also held accountable for all of the crimes. Together, the couple was sentenced to death by lethal injection at the age of 76 and 69. Now, the reason why Faye was found guilty was the fact that not only did she know of the murders, but she had also helped her husband commit them and then cover up for them. However, her lawyers put forward the case that she was only following Ray's orders, and because he was so abusive towards her, she had no other choice.
She came as a regular therapy client brought by the deputies, pretty much weekly, for about 9 months. She looked extraordinarily beaten down. A very, very sad person. He was the complete dictator.
Why separate?
And anyone who crossed him, or for any reason that he was offended or upset, he would physically lash out at whoever was closest or whoever was on his mind. She always put him first. That was the nature of her life.
The only reason why she was convicted was the fact that the list of names was written in her handwriting, and the police had found a quilt that she had made out of the dead man's clothes. And some believed that these 2 things weren't really solid enough grounds for her to be held responsible for Ray's crimes.
Ray was illiterate and could not write. Ray had told her to write down particular names, and sometimes he told her to put X's by them. True to form, she didn't question why they were X's.
What's even stranger is that when Ray was told about his wife being given a death sentence, he showed no emotion at all, saying that these things happen to some people. Ray and Faye's reign of terror came to an end quite uneventfully. Both of them were on death row when they died of natural causes. Ray died in 1993, and soon after that, Faye also passed away of a stroke in 2003.
It was my love, the love of my life, and my kids. I will always feel love in my heart for it.
After their death, the police discovered 7 additional murders that could have been committed by the couple. And while some believed that Faye was a battered old wife who was just following her cruel husband's orders, a lot of people also hold the opinion that she was just as cold-blooded as Ray himself.
Bueno, pues cuando uno se muere, pues pierde uno por total, pierde uno lo que es los sentimientos, su visibilidad de los ojos para ver, y una muerte que uno ya no vuelve ni saber quién es uno, ¿no? Todo queda así en una oscuridad nula. Esto queda en la historia, ¿sí o no? ¿Sí me van a pasar otra vez? Yo estoy muy joven para morir.
Known to be the monster of the Andes, Pedro Alonso Lopez is known to be responsible for the murder of over 300 young girls. A convicted children's offender and serial killer, what's truly spine-chilling is the fact that he still hasn't been caught for his crimes. The son of a streetwalker, Pedro Lopez never really knew his father because he was murdered by a mob while his mom Belinda was 3 months pregnant with him. When he was born, he became the 7th of Belinda's 13 children, and as a result, he was often the victim of a lot of negligence from his mother. At the same time, since he was a young child, he was exposed to the world of drugs and prostitution. As a result, Pedro grew up with an incredibly sick mind. On countless occasions, he sexually assaulted his younger siblings, and when Belinda discovered what was going on, she kicked him out of the house. At this point, Pedro was just 12 years old, but his mother didn't think twice about abandoning him instead of getting him the help he needed. Pedro then ended up at a school for orphaned children, but he soon ran away from there, claiming that his male teacher had violated him. After that, he started living on the streets, committing petty crimes like stealing cars and selling them to support himself. However, the police soon caught on to his act, and he was sent to prison. And that's where he really went unhinged. When he was in jail, Lopez had to face the threat of constant violation and assault by the gang members at the prison. However, that sparked the need to take revenge inside of him. He remembered the faces of every prisoner who assaulted him, and during his sentence, he hunted every single one of them down, killing them with the weapons that he made on his own. And that's how he realized how much he loved killing people. Pedro's crimes inside the prison went untraced, and as a result, he was able to get out after serving his sentence. And that's when he started hunting down young girls to satisfy the murderer in him. He would kidnap, assault, and then kill these young girls who belonged to several different villages in Peru. By 1978, he had murdered almost 100 girls, and the only reason his crimes came to light was that a few members of a native tribe had caught him in the act. At this point, it was discovered that he was attacking an average of 3 underage girls per week, and when all of this came to light, the village natives demanded for him to be executed. After he was caught, beaten up, and tortured, the plan was to pour sugar syrup on his head, leaving him to be eaten alive by ants and other insects. However, his life was spared when an American missionary asked the tribe members to just hand him over to the police. The tribe members believed the missionary and handed Pedro to him. However, surprise, surprise, the American drove him all the way to the Colombian border, where he allowed Pedro to run free and escape from his fate.
Gente de raza indígena y humilde.
They were poor, indigenous people, street vendors. These were the types of little girls that he chose. The poorest kids who have lesser education. He never chose white people.
He then started traveling through Colombia and Ecuador, picking up and murdering young girls as he went. And while initially the police believed that the reason behind all these sudden disappearances was some prostitution ring, they were surprised to find out that all of this was the work of one man. Pedro would later reveal that it was easier for him to trick Ecuadorian girls into trusting him because they were supposedly more innocent. His crimes came to light when a flash flood hit Ecuador, leading to the discovery of 4 bodies of children who had gone missing. A few days later, Lopez was caught trying to abduct a 12-year-old girl before her mother caught him on the spot. The village natives then almost lynched him to death.
Something that struck me about Pedro Alonso was how cold he acted when he was identifying the gravesites. It was as if what he'd done was normal.
However, a bunch of police officers showed up on the scene and took Pedro with them to interrogate this entire situation. And while he refused to confess or admit to anything in the beginning, Lopez did eventually end up leading the police to the dead body of one of his victims, which is also where he admitted to killing over 100 young girls in Ecuador and a dozen others in Peru and Colombia. At the same time, he claimed he was a good person with a clean heart. However, when all of this was revealed, the police made him take them to all of the places where he had left bodies of his victims in groups of 3 and 4, and the exercise continued until all of the bodies were recovered.
Nobody realized it was the criminal who was leading police to the graves. They dressed him up as a policeman and nobody recognized him.
Their first stop was on the outskirts of Ambato.
Él declaró, o sea, él había dicho a la policía que...
He told police he had caught a girl who sold newspapers and that he killed her and that she was buried under the Ficoa Bridge.
We found a complete skeleton with clothes on it. Of course, the body was decomposed. And when we look at it, we found the bones were corroded. I remember, a leg and a hand.
Lopez would bury his victims in shallow graves and would often return back to dig them out and play with their corpses. He liked doing all of this, including his murders and abductions, in the light of day, because he had some sick, twisted fantasy of wanting to see his victims' faces when he committed his crimes. And while the number of bodies identified was officially around 110, the police believe that his actual victim count is to have been more than 300. After all of this went down, Lopez was convicted of 3 actual murders and sentenced to 16 years in prison in 1980. However, he somehow went on to be the perfect prisoner who was let out a little over 10 years later on the grounds of good behavior. However, because he was an illegal immigrant, he was deported to Colombia only an hour later, despite his protests. Wherever he went, though, he was met with mobs of angry people demanding his head for all of the crimes he had committed. Concerned for his safety, the authorities moved him to El Español. For a while, things were good, but then another woman came forward and claimed that she had seen Lopez walking away with her daughter right before she was found dead in 1979. The case was eerily similar to all of the murders that Lopez had committed in Ecuador, and after a short trial, he was found to be guilty of the crime. His lawyers worked hard, and he was declared mentally insane, resulting in him being committed to a mental hospital rather than a prison. But what's freaky is that in 1998, Lopez was declared mentally fit once again and was released on bail under the condition that he kept receiving psychiatric care and reporting to the police at regular intervals so they could track down everything he was doing. Of course, the news of this shocking release angered people all over Ecuador, but he mysteriously ended up disappearing, never to be seen in Ecuador again. To this day, the police have no idea where this cold-blooded murderer is hiding. That is, if he is still alive.